My friends, today I have something kind of special for you. I sat down with DevOps guru Ryan Arujo to record a session on Azure SQL deployment and security for the 100 Days of Infrastructure as Code in Azure series, and we wound up doing a lot of show and tell around the configurable security features of Azure SQL. So whether you're trying to level up your infrastructure as code skills or you're preparing for Microsoft's AZ-500 exam, today we have a little something for everybody, and this is the first in a two-part series. So part 2 is going to drop later this week, but come check this out. Make sure you come back for part 2 as we dive deeper later this week. I think you're going to like what you see. Let's get to it. All right, and we should be live at this point. So welcome everyone. Today we are talking about Azure SQL, and we're going to be doing double duty here, talking through Azure SQL in a DevOps context for our audience for the what we're calling another 100 days of Azure infrastructure as code. And we're going to have a few nuggets in here for our friends who are preparing for Microsoft security exams, in particular for the AZ-500, which is the one that gets you the earns you the Azure Security Engineer Associate badge. And I brought with me here today, joining us from Austria, is DevOps guru and sort of co-creator of that 100 Days of Infrastructure as Code series, Ryan Arujo. So Ryan, thanks for joining us. It's I know getting a bit late there in Austria, so we'll try not to take too long. So let's,
thanks for having me, Pete. I appreciate it. Always glad to join you on one of these events, podcasts, or shows. We still haven't decided what you're going to call this long term, have we?
It doesn't really have to have a name. This is really organic. We're just here to share some knowledge with our friends. So let's not even give it a name. Let's just get after it. So Ryan,
right.
What I wanted to talk to you about, and I want to keep this really organic and just talk through some of the methodologies that we have at our avail. So we're gonna focus in on Azure SQL, but let's start at the beginning. So let's start with deployment. So if you're thinking about deploying an Azure SQL instance, what are the options you have at your avail?
So the options you would have for you right off the bat is that you could deploy Azure SQL using PowerShell.
Right.
You could use the Azure CLI, PowerShell being Azure PowerShell, or you could do it as an ARM template. Those would be the three main methods you would use.
There you go. So let's just take those. Give me your favorite of those three and tell me why.
CLI, hands down. CLI is simply because it is idempotent by nature. It's pretty easy to actually manage code or do infrastructure as code using Azure CLI.
Right.
And you have a lot of capabilities within the Azure CLI and the commandlets, if you will, in Azure CLI that allow you to interact, query, and set properties of resources that you deploy in Azure.
Yeah, and there you have it. So you called out a couple of things that are pretty interesting there. So you mentioned that the Azure CLI is idempotent, which I think is something that probably slips past a lot of folks because it's not really put out front and center. It's in the Azure CLI documentation. And that being said, though, Ryan, it integrates with a pipeline in Azure DevOps really nicely as well, eh?
Absolutely. I mean, because you already have the Azure CLI task baked in either into the classic build pipelines or using the task and YAML build pipelines. And in general, with the teams I work with, we're doing everything using the YAML build pipelines, and that is very well documented on how to actually implement and use either using the Azure CLI and or bash scripts, however you want to manage that with YAML build pipelines. So a lot of flexibility there.
So what do you say we try to deploy something, and while it's deploying, we'll talk about some of what's going to come up on exams for some of our AZ-500 folks.
Sure, absolutely. The first thing we need, and you can actually, my screen is shared right now, right?
I see your screen indeed.
All right, excellent. So the first thing is we need to create an actual resource group to demonstrate and to deploy this actual SQL database. So I'm going to paste something in here from another screen, and I'm just running a simple command here to create a resource group, AZ group create, and we're going to call this 100 days, that's Azure DB, and we're going to deploy it in West Europe. Actually, do you think we should deploy in East US, since that's where you're currently located, right?
Yeah. So for those of you that are joining us here, we saw some deployment blockers as we were trying to spin up a cloud shell in Western Europe. So we're running in the US now. Yeah, I'd keep it all stateside here.
Temporarily for this demo only.
America.
As you can see, we've just simply deployed a resource group very quickly. You will see the provisioning state as being succeeded before it actually appears in the Azure portal, by the way. So that's something you want to be aware of. And it will take a minute or so before you'll see it populate in the Azure portal, but it is available and ready to use. And speaking of the idempotence that we were just referring to, if I run this script again, or run this command again, it's not going to change anything or error out. It's going to look for the existing resource group, and just if it finds it and there's nothing changed with any properties or anything that we're not setting, it succeeds.
Yeah, so for our DevOps friend, that's the idempotence there. So when you're thinking about infrastructure as code, and basically, your benefit there is it's simpler to write code to deal with that. The other thing I really like about Cloud Shell is if I'm working with a group that's new to Azure, maybe they're open source folks, if they're writing Python or Bash and not comfortable with PowerShell or ARM templates, the Azure CLI is a great way to reach across the aisle, so to speak, and to meet those folks where they are and say, you don't need to learn a brand new language. We can bring you into Azure comfortably by just meeting you where you are, and we'll write Bash scripts together using Azure CLI with this really simple syntax, right?
Correct. One thing, and you can remind me to do this again for the commands that we're running here, so it's easier to read than raw JSON. We'll have raw JSON output for the most part, but we'll make sure that everything is in color.
Do me a favor and see if you can swing your scroll wheel there and bump your font size. I'm not sure you can.
Sure, I
make
can do
me
that.
Totally happy there, but just for
never. We'll go with large. How's that?
That's perfect. Yeah, I just want to give our friends here watching video. Yeah, so you see the AZ group create, pretty simple syntax, and also I find that the parameters are very consistent across the CLI.
Exactly. So what would you like to move into next? I mean, we have some prerequisites that we recommend people do before actually deploying an Azure SQL database to test the first time, such as generating a password and creating we're going to create a random name in here as well for the SQL Server to ensure that whoever is running this isn't going to run into the problem of trying to deploy the exact same name.
Yeah. So just walk through those steps that you normally do, and let's just talk about those as you do them. So generate your random string, get your password, and just roll out an instance.
Sure, absolutely. So first thing, we want to generate an actual random password in our case. If you have a password that you want to set that you like to use for your environment, you can of course do that as well. But the tool we're going to be using is UUID, which is available in here in Cloud Shell because the Cloud Shell is running in a Linux container. So that we can set this random value to a variable we can use later in the deployment, you'll see here we've set it to the SQL Server admin password variable. And if we echo that out, you will plainly see that that value is then available to us.
Yeah.
If you want to say something, Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, and so for those of you that are studying for exams, if you're working on a DevOps exam or you're working on AZ-500, what you can see in common for both of those exams is you might be tested on your knowledge around the commands or command syntax for deploying. So we'll look at Azure CLI here. We'll talk about PowerShell briefly. We'll point you to an ARM template over in our 100 days repo, so you'll have eyes on all three methodologies, because those are absolutely things that could be thrown at you on the exam. I like for us to do the Azure CLI, because that tends to be, I think, the one folks are least likely to be exposed to, strangely.
Fair point. Now that we've generated our password, that's ready to go. Now we want to generate a 4-character alphanumeric surname for the SQL Server to ensure that it is unique, and that if you're following along with this, you can copy and paste the commands in here, and you won't have to worry about setting up variables manually. And so what we've done here is we're generating another random set of characters, and we're going to pull the first 4 characters out of it. Now that I think about this, some tools that you may have been familiar with that are available in Linux, either Debian or Red Hat, may not be available in Azure Cloud Shell. So I'm going to probably have to change this command around a little bit, and I'll do that right now because I can see it's hanging. So I'm going to take a wild guess here and probably find that, yeah, getting exactly what we're looking for here.
Mm-hmm.
So let's try it this way. We're going to combine the previous command that we had. We're going to use UUID again. Let's see what we get for random alpha. And there we go. So that's working a lot better. Dev urandom urandom is not working the same way in Cloud Shell in this particular container as it would normally work when I originally wrote most of these instructions for Ubuntu 18.04. Go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, sure. No, it definitely evolves or behaves differently from time to time. I get you.
Yeah. Either way, though, we can still get what we need here: a random 4-digit character, 31D1, that we're going to use for the surname of our SQL Server.
And this is because we need a globally unique name, right?
Correct. Globally, in regards to the location we're deploying to. In our particular case, since we're going to deploy everything to East US now, let me massage one thing here real quick. And if you're watching at home, you're wondering, all right, what's he doing? I'm using a notepad on another screen here just to massage what we're pasting in here. Okay, so here's the Azure CLI command we're going to run, AZ SQL Server Create. And within this command, we're defining the name of the SQL Server we're deploying, the resource group it's going into, the location, East US, an initial admin user, SQL ADM days. We're passing in the SQL Server admin password that we set earlier. And I'm running a query here to output the actual name of the SQL Server and the state of its deployment at the end when the command is finished running. So if I didn't do that, I would normally get probably 150, 200 lines of JSON. So by running a query, using the query switch here, I can return back only the JSON that I am looking for from the output from the command, and I'm outputting it in TSV format. So there's no most of the formatting is actually removed, such as if it was in double quotes. So I get the raw output basically.
Yeah, and so you see there, folks, you see AZ SQL Server Create as your core syntax. So for the AZ-500 exam, I think you're going to be less likely to be taxed on deployment, and you're going to be much more likely to be tested on aspects of configuration. So once we get this instance deployed, I think we'll get more into AZ-500 territory. I think we're going to see questions there around encryption at rest. We'll have questions around resource firewall. On DevOps exams, though, deployment is going to be much more likely to be in scope. So you want to be familiar with this. And again, make sure you go out. This will be day 102 in the 100 more days of infrastructure as code. So you'll be able to grab source code here as well.
Correct.
So that is deploying. And do you have a SQL instance already, Ryan? I don't think you do.
I don't. We don't have one in this subscription that's available. We looked earlier and we were out of luck.
No worries. So let me just shoot you over. Let me just take the screen from you for a second here, and I want to show the folks a tutorial. So for the PowerShell flavor of things, folks, what I'm going to do is share with you a tutorial. So here's a, can you see my screen, Ryan?
I can, go ahead.
Yeah, so for those of you that are just preparing for an exam of one sort or another, PowerShell, as we've said, is not our favorite way to deploy these resources. But if you know PowerShell, then definitely that's going to be a strong candidate for you. So there's a nice tutorial out here. It's use PowerShell to create a single database and to configure a server level firewall rule. So this will be a good step into this world. So you can use the Azure Cloud Shell, and there's a sample PowerShell script here. So I'm going to share with you 2 URLs in the day 102 notes. One will be this tutorial, and the other will be a link to a master list of samples of PowerShell around Azure SQL. So it will give you full visibility into all of the potential ways that you can configure. Sorry, the scroll wheel here going a little nuts. It really wants me to be at the bottom of the screen here for some reason. Wow. But you've got a nice PowerShell script, and you want to be familiar for exams with the PowerShell commandlet. So you'll notice here on my screen, we've got a new dash AZ SQL Server, new AZ SQL Server firewall rule, new AZ SQL database. So any of these could come up in the context of questions where they ask you to pick the code you need to run to complete a task. Just bearing that in mind. And when you get into the world of DevOps, we could even see content related to what do you plug that into in an Azure DevOps pipeline, right? So if I'm in Azure DevOps, though, I'm either using a bash task over there, or I'm using deploy new resource group, right? Which will take an ARM template.
Absolutely. Pete, our SQL Server has finished deploying.
Okay, well, go ahead and take it back from me, and let's jump into it.
Yep. You might have better luck pulling up on your portal what's going on. So we may do that next.
Okay.
Wrong button. Hang on.
Sure.
Share this up again here. Yeah. This is what I'm getting right now. Yay. But this is in the actual portal view of trying to refresh the 100 days resource group. So I'm kind of amused. But our deployment succeeded. And so we have outputted the name of our SQL Server and that its state is now set to ready. Since I can query the resource groups from the portal right now, if you run into an issue whereby the front end is unavailable to you, you can always run some other type of query. So we can do AZ SQL Server list, and then we're going to run a query. And we're going to query the output, which will come in an array format, and we're going to list out the names of the SQL servers that should be available. And there we have it. So we know that our SQL Server is in fact deployed and ready to go. We just need to wait for either the portal to come alive and show what's in there, or Pete, you try now.
Yeah, let me just do that right quick. I'll hit the portal here and see if I can.
Never mind. I got it. Yes.
There you
It's
go.
back.
Look at that. Just had to threaten. Yeah,
So,
give me a little bump there, and let's have a look at what we have here. So
sure.
you deployed single database, new server instance.
There's no database yet.
No
We have
database
only
yet. So you
deployed
just
the
deploy. Yeah,
server.
that's right. You just deployed the server instance.
Correct. No data in here yet. So it's completely open to where you want to cover next. And if you'd like to do that, sharing your screen and go through some of the settings in here before we deploy a database, that's maybe a pretty good idea.
Why don't you go ahead and kick off the database deployment, and then while we watch that cook, I'll step through some. I'll actually step through some settings in another environment where I have a fully configured SQL instance.
Okay.
And talk through some of those security related settings that'll be important for our DevOps friends, but important for everybody who's thinking about exams of any sort.
Sounds good to me.
Let's see here.
There's the database. Okay, so we will be kicking off AZ SQL DB Create, and the name of this database is called Wide World Imports STD standard. This will be a test database that we will well, we can, if you want to, we can import an actual database at the end of this demo for our viewers.
Okay.
As you can see here, we're deploying this to our server. We're using standard DB Gen 5. Service objective is S2, so it's slightly above normal. And like our previous command, we're going to return back the name and the status of the database once it has been deployed. So while that's running, Pete.
Yeah, let me just share my screen here, and I'll take over a bit. So what I want to do now is just walk through some of the settings that you'll see in your Azure SQL instance, and talk about the significance there. You know, so especially from a security and from an exam perspective. So I'm in the Azure portal. I'm just at portal.azure.com, and you'll see here I'm looking at SQL Server. So you get to that either by pulling it out of your menu if you've got it pinned, or just literally typing SQL Servers, where you'll get your Azure SQL. So I have a couple of instances here, and I'll just drill into either one of these really. So you can see the 100 days instance there, which is what Ryan deployed. So when I look at the properties of my SQL instance, here in the center menu, I've got some configurable items. So if I go to firewalls and networks, what I want to point out first is that we can set firewall rules, and you can add firewall rules at the server level and the database level. So we've got that, what we'd call resource firewall capability. And you're going to see that come up on the AZ-500 exam almost certainly. And if I were guessing where you'd see it, so more and more resources all the time support resource firewall, but the two most common areas that I hear come up in conversation are Azure SQL and then Azure Storage. But be prepared for that just about anywhere. So you see here that when I click on firewalls and virtual networks, I don't have any firewall rules, but I can create them. You see I can add IP addresses. There's my client IP automatically. And you'll notice here that I can allow Azure services to access this server, true or false, so I can turn off or turn on access to other Azure services just right out of the box. I've got some connection policy settings here. I doubt you're going to see anything on the exam here. There's certainly nothing called out on skills measured. But if I click into here, so just notice this as you're playing around with the features. If you don't know what a setting does exactly, use this Learn More option, and that'll pop out there. And for those of you that don't have Azure, make sure that you look at the free hands-on learning that Microsoft gives you for your exams, because the MS Learn content will have exercises, and those exercises will use something called Azure Sandbox. And Azure Sandbox gives you Azure access without a subscription, without so much as an Azure Active Directory logon. You just need, a Microsoft account, the equivalent of what you might remember as a Live ID. And you can get that sort of access to play around. And oftentimes those exercises are going to drop you into a cloud shell similar to what you saw Ryan working with earlier there. But for security related exams, I expect you're going to see potentially questions around resource firewall, transparent data encryption, which I just clicked on here in the menu as well. Not a new feature. I think transparent data encryption has been around since SQL 2008, if memory serves. And TDE is protection for data at rest. For AZ-500, I think this is a likely topic. Maybe TDE comes up on one of your DevOps exams. I'm not certain it would just right off the top, but certainly it's going to be in scope for AZ-500. You'll also see that you can get into a Security Center here. So Azure Defender for SQL. So I want to call this out because you may look at that and say, well, what is Azure Defender for SQL? So about 3 or 4 days ago, as of the time of the recording of this session, I dropped a video talking about the changes to Microsoft security services, and you need to watch that. So Azure Defender for SQL is what used to be called Azure SQL Advanced Threat Protection. So I created a video that actually walks through all of those changes and really the Azure changes, the Azure Defender changes they're called, will be most likely in scope for AZ-500. So you'll need to be familiar with Azure Defender for SQL, for IoT, for servers, for Kubernetes. But go watch that video. It's about 10, 11 minutes long, and it'll take you through all of those changes. But this is what used to be Advanced Threat Protection, and you're going to find that you need to flip that switch. You can optionally turn on a recurring scan, so you can have Azure Defender for SQL actually scan once a week. So it's off by default. So just remember that. And you see here it mentions Advanced Threat Protection settings. So that's some of that old branding and new branding kind of mixing here, so to speak. It is in fact Advanced Threat Protection, but this is the Azure Defender for SQL that we're looking at. And then we can get into Advanced Threat Protection type. So I can get in here and you'll notice that I can configure which attacks that I would like Advanced Threat Protection to work on for me. So why might I want to turn one of these off? If it broke my app, maybe. But honestly, I think I would lean toward fix my app behavior. If I was having a problem, I'd suspect my app maybe had a like a SQL injection vulnerability, for example, like my code wasn't up to snuff. So I'd deal with that before I just went in and started shutting things off. But I just wanted to give you a look at those configuration options. Yeah.
I think going back to that view with those options, I think the thing to take into account for this is that if you're migrating an older application, say something that's 5, 7, 10 years old, this may be where you run into that issue. For instance, like you stated, if there was something about the app that was working before, obviously in an on-premise environment, and then it stops working, it's entirely possible that someone 7, 10 years ago, or whatever time frame it was, they were doing things in a hurry and were, for instance, writing SQL queries that, of course, were vulnerable to injection. So that may be a feasible reason to want to have to turn these off, but I agree with you. In general, go fix your code.
Yeah, and let me give you another option you could go. So in order to handle legacy apps and to provide an on-premises type SQL Server experience, you've also got the managed instance option, right? So you could go that route instead of going to Azure SQL, and I'd probably go that route because, man, turning off advanced defenses, nobody feels good about that, right? So you could go that legacy path, but yeah, to your point, you've still got bad code, and you have to fix it.
Yep.
So that being said, you all have seen a couple of the settings here. TDE, I think, is something that's likely to come up on an exam because that's an infrastructure focused element. Any of these things could come up on the right DevOps exam. I'm just going to jump into auditing here. So when it comes to auditing and logging in general, what you're likely to see on Microsoft exams is where can I send my logs? So if I'm enabling auditing on Azure SQL, for example, I can send it to Azure Storage, I can send it to Log Analytics, and I can send it to Event Hub. So somebody was arguing with me the other day that Event Grid was the correct answer. It's so close that I can see why one would get those two mixed up. But that being said, you could also see this sort of question come up on a security exam. Although it is its own topic, and we'll talk about private endpoints and service. We'll talk about endpoints in a separate discussion. But I think private endpoints is something else that could come up on AZ-500 in particular, but I think on the right DevOps exam as well. Certainly something you all could be, you all will want to be prepared to talk about. But like I say, that's probably a half an hour all by itself. That being said, Ryan, do you have an ARM template handy from our previous discussion?
For deploying what specifically?
Yeah. Could you pull up? I think we had an ARM template in day 87. Would you mind pulling that up?
Sure. Let me see if I can find that real quick.
And while you're doing that, I want to talk about authentication. So the other area where I could see you getting questions on the AZ-500 exam in particular will be around authentication for your databases. So
found the ARM template. Where do you want it, mister?
Just pull it up in a browser or in the
Sure.
portal, and let's talk about it. Go ahead and start configuring yourself for deployment, and I'll turn the controls over to you in just
sure.
In just a sec.
Okay. So we're going to go to, there we go, day 87. Sharing my screen again. And so down here, after we went the lazy route, to be honest, because it was faster to just use AZ Group Create real quick. And then below, we do have a basic ARM template for deploying a SQL Server and a database in one shot, which is here. So let's zoom in a little bit, make that a little bit easier.
And so for those of you that are working on either of these exams, this is going to be a front and center sort of high probability deployment question. I would, because ARM templates are idempotent and declarative, right? That's
correct.
That's your one of your incremental values. What Ryan's showing you here is high probability, I think, as something that you'll be expected to be familiar with.
Correct. Should we go through the sections of this or leave that for another discussion? Because we could spend an entire session honestly talking about everything.
We could spend a lot of time breaking this off. I think we wanted to point this out just to say you want to be familiar with what an ARM template looks like for Azure SQL, because it's one of those deployment methodologies that you could be quizzed on, and Ryan's got this really nicely documented here.
Yeah, and the other thing to our viewers, we want to point out as well that one thing to take into account here are the parameter values that are being passed to the ARM template that are included here above. And we've ensured that there's a table here so that you know which parameters you can play around with that will always work or should always work with this ARM template. That's the other thing we should also point out. The double-edged sword of ARM templates actually is also how the resources or the API backend that's communicating with over time, as Azure Cloud develops over time, your ARM templates can go out of date and they may start breaking. So if you start using them, you have to stay on top of maintaining them if you're going to be using them actively a lot. So.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point. And on that note, if you open your ARM templates in Visual Studio Code, and you have
Yeah, we
the
can do
right
that quick.
plugins in place, it will actually prompt you to update those templates.
Correct. I don't have Visual Studio Code.
Oh,
I
you don't
have
have
it,
to
but
show.
I
I just
don't have it
wanted to
open
kind
yet.
of throw that out there as a neither
Yeah,
here
yeah.
nor there sort of thing, because that's how I sort of keep them up to date. Is I'll let I've got all of the Azure DevOps and ARM tools plugins in place in Visual Studio Code, so I'll let the IDE tell me what I need there.
Correct. Let it do the work.
Yeah,
Um,
and so another thing to just mention about ARM templates, for everyone's edification. So we mentioned that the advantage of Azure CLI over Azure SQL is that the CLI is idempotent, where PowerShell is not, and you have an incremental advantage with ARM templates over Azure CLI, in that ARM templates are also idempotent, but they are also declarative. So which is going to be the ideal when you're writing infrastructure as code. You want your code to be declarative and idempotent, so we can deploy multiple times and always get the same result. But we're defining behavior in a very proactive way with a
correct.
declarative methodology like that.
Well, I'm waiting for this to load here. I wanted to go back here real quick, Pete, and mention that our database did deploy. Our name of our database, Worldwide Imports, is returned, and the status of our database is online. I can't explain why I'm getting a lot of lag or delay from displaying everything here, but our database is now in our resource group and associated with our SQL Server. And if this is going to continue to take a while, we may, you know what? Let's flip back over to your screen right now, because we can do a few
Sure.
more things on your side,
Absolutely.
actually.
Yeah.
Actually, before we change over, I'm going to run two more commands, and I want to
Okay.
show them in here. And those are in regards to firewall rules, because
Yeah,
those are
great.
pretty important. So before we flip over to back to Pete's screen, I'm going to create two distinct rules. The first rule is going to allow all access to the SQL database. And we're using a starting IP address of 0.0.0 and 0.0.0.0 again for the end IP address. This should allow full access to the SQL Server by default. Another one I'm going to add in here, just to show that it will work, and you can add this in later, is I'm adding one for the mighty Pete Zerger. And since he flashed his public IP address at home, I figured, hey, let's go ahead and create a rule for him as well, and we can show you where that rule is going to show up and what that looks like. And oh, that's interesting. What happened here? It's saying there is a syntax error in here somewhere. So let me look at that real quick.
Yeah, and that being said, resource firewall is a newer feature in Azure. It's not brand new, but what you're going to find on exams is Microsoft is going to be much more likely to test you on modern, cutting edge technologies. Technically by the book, they mention that they're not going to test you on preview technologies. But we saw Azure Sentinel creep onto the AZ-500 exam in particular, and there's a lot in Azure Sentinel that's still flagged as preview, and I wouldn't be surprised if you'd see it on the exams, because it's been in preview for a long time and doesn't feel like preview, some of it. Sentinel itself, Azure Sentinel itself is GA, but not every feature is GA. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, so I figured out my syntax issue. If you were an astute viewer, you probably noticed I was missing a double colon here at the start IP address parameter, which is why why my command would not complete. So our firewall rules are now in place. We have one for all open access, and we've also allowed specifically from Pete's public IP address at home as well. So Pete, if we want to flip over to your screen and let's browse to the SQL Server and see if these rules are in place.
Absolutely. So, and to be clear there, Ryan set up a server level firewall rule, and we can set up server level rules and we can set up database level rules.
Correct.
So I'm just going to share my screen here, and I will jump into, I'm looking at SQL servers. And again, I just went to portal.azure.com and typed in SQL Server. And so I'll go to Ryan's instance here. So I want to point out, I mentioned authentication is an area that you might be tested on an exam, and it's certainly going to be important from an infrastructure as code perspective. So at the server level, I have Active Directory admin here. So you'll notice that Azure Active Directory authentication allows me to centrally manage identity and access to my server, and I can set an admin here at the server level. Now Ryan also deployed
Firewall and virtual networks. It's under security.
So we'll just scroll down here. We'll look at Firewall and we'll see the rule. So you see here, Ryan put allow Pete Zerger home access for me. So mission accomplished there. And we should also see databases at this point. So if I just go to, whoops, sorry, my scroll wheel is just going a little nutty in the, specifically in, wow.
Clean your mouse, Pete. I blame the mouse.
I've got a dirty mouse.
Yes, you have a dirty mouse.
And a dirty mouth, but okay. So here I'm looking at SQL databases, and I'll click on that worldwide imports database. And so now I can look at properties at the database level. So I can get down here and see things like my connection strings, my sync to other databases, etc. A few configurable items, related to support, to performance, and so forth. You see here I can configure when I look at the configure option, it gives me some performance level configuration options. And on the topic of security, so I mentioned, we looked at Azure Defender for SQL, formerly SQL Advanced Threat Protection. We talked about transparent data encryption, which is your encryption at rest. We've looked at resource firewall, and you'll actually see multiple other types of configuration. So one of those, for example, might be always encrypted. You might also see dynamic data masking. So I'm just going to quickly point you to an article. I've got an article out on LinkedIn that's 5 ways to secure your SQL data in Microsoft Azure. Strangely, the 5 areas I call out here are still all active today, so they're very much relevant in terms of their capability for configuring SQL, Azure SQL protection. So we have always encrypted, which we would use for securing sensitive data like credit cards and SSNs. We've got row level security, which is exactly what it sounds like. We've got dynamic data masking, which allows us to mask data in a particular field. So for example, if you're ever shopping, you know how you get just the last 4 digits of your credit card or your phone number or your social security number? That's dynamic data masking, conceptually speaking. And then we've got transparent data encryption, for data at rest, which is just, the vanilla ice cream of data protection. And then we have, SQL threat, advanced threat protection, or what was called SQL threat detection when I wrote this article. So it's gone through a couple of name changes now. So maybe I'll go back and update this article at some point. But definitely, on the infrastructure as code side for your DevOps exams, you want to be familiar with all the ways you can protect SQL. For the AZ-500 exam, I think you're going to be much more likely to see questions around transparent data encryption, around Azure Defender for SQL, because that offering came in what was Azure Security Center, right? And so that's Azure Security Center shows up in domain 3 of the AZ-500 exam. So you want to make sure that you have eyes on that. At the close of this session, I'm actually going to show you all some of the resources that you can go out to study for exams. So make sure you do that. But for any of these exams, for any of the DevOps exams, for the associate level security exams like AZ-500, you're dealing with a technically deep exam, folks. So Microsoft assumes you have a couple of years of experience. They're assuming you've got some hands-on experience. They're not expecting that you're Ryan, who is top of the mountain for me in terms of his skills, in the areas of DevOps and deployment automation. But they are definitely assuming that, all of these topics that, that we've covered today, you're going to expect it to be conversant there for security and DevOps types exams. So Ryan, this is a really good demo. I appreciate everything you've shown us here today.
Sure, no problem.
So tell us where we can find you on social media, and I'll make sure we share your addresses on the call out at the end of the session.
Sure, absolutely. You can find me at Ryan Irujo at LinkedIn, and you can also find me on Twitter. My handle is at REIRUJO. So
yeah, and folks, I'll throw Ryan's accounts up on the screen here so you can find him. And where can we find all of this great 100 days of infrastructure as code content on GitHub? Why don't I just pull up your repo here? So what I've got here, folks, github.com/starkfell/100 days of IAC. You'll notice Ryan's got a nice table of contents here. We'll have a day 102 waiting for you there. And Ryan, with that, I think we've probably talked you to bedtime.
And a beer.
So beer's on me. So thanks for the demonstration and the code and everything here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.
And that's a wrap for part 1 of Azure SQL Deployment and Security. Join us back here for part 2 later this week, where we will continue diving deeper. Take care. Good luck. See you in the next video.